Like giant exclamation marks, skyscrapers punctuate the story of our urban development.
We have 1 million people urbanizing on this planet every day.
From their humble beginnings in the late 19th century,
They were, at the time, the equivalent of our going to the moon.
to giants still under construction, they complement and define our contemporary lives.
People always want to reach. There's something heavenly about it, and people have wanted to race for height forever.
There's some kind of like impulse or basic instinct that we just love it, right?
It's about defying gravity and leaving a sign of humanity.
From Chicago to London, from Tokyo to Dubai, this is a tale of many great cities racing to build to the sky.
The reason we want to go higher, I think it's very deep inside us. You know, it's part of our mythology, the Tower of Babel. When you go hiking, you want to see what's over the top of the hill. It's very, very central to our being.
As engineers and architects, it's a great way to show our technological feat to reach the sky.
And it's also a tale of constant evolution, constant improvement, and progress, honestly.
Skylines plot the pulse of the world's greatest cities, with each soaring tower recording a spike in the thrill of urban development. With every generation, we are compelled to build safer, to build smarter, and clearly, much higher. And nowhere is this legacy more enduring than the Windy City of Chicago.
You can look at a place like Los Angeles, which is known for its entertainment industry. You can look at New York, which would be finance. Miami would be fashion, and Chicago really is architecture.
Well, Chicago, it's like a history class in tall building architecture. All different generations, all different architects have contributed to it.
Part of the great thing the architecture community has done is to always build differently. So everything is sort of a riot of different styles and different eras. Everything holds up. You really have to stand back and appreciate just what the architects have sort of done over 100+ years, what they've really given us.
Founded in 1830, Chicago grew exponentially in the mid-19th century, as immigrants flocked to the Midwest seeking to profit from the opportunities in the new trading hub.
Chicago was the first modern city. It was the first city to be conceived in a modern way. And Chicago had the fortuitous, but also the infamous start because of the fire.
A great fire struck the sprawling lakeside town of Chicago and threatened to wipe its very name off the map.
And the fire had basically destroyed everything in Chicago, which at that time were simply wood frame buildings.
In one terrifying day, thousands of homes and public buildings were destroyed.
But it had the opportunity to really think anew about the city and what it means to build in a modern way.
Within a few years, the city rose again to become one of the great cities of America.
Within 6 weeks, 300 new buildings were on the rise.
Some of Chicago's new buildings were the first skyscrapers, marking a new departure in architecture.
When the sort of phoenix rises from the ashes, it's architecture that saves Chicago. It's architecture that's our birthright. And that gives rise to an ethic at the street level that everyone just understands that our forefathers aren't statesmen. Our forefathers are great architects.
And what happened in Chicago, by destroying all of that city center acreage, it gave the opportunity for architects who lived in Chicago, but also architects who lived elsewhere and needed work, to come to Chicago. It brought new talent to the city.
This is after the Civil War. Guys like Daniel Burnham, William Barangeni, they were all in the Union Army. They knew how to put a bridge up very quickly out of whatever they could find.
Architecture as a profession didn't exist, so it was engineers who did buildings. They had a wide variety of influences, but they were neoclassically trained architects who had either studied abroad or had been studying on the East Coast at schools like MIT.
The city became a training ground for up-and-coming architects, a talented pool of individuals known as the First Chicago School.
These early pioneers in Chicago were very pragmatic individuals, businessmen, commerce-driven. Chicago always has been, and presumably always will be. But at the same time, there was a sort of symbolism and an aspiration that went with the developments.
The famed Chicago School, a group of architects, commercial architects, business architects, designing business buildings for businessmen, also had a kind of mantra or ethic about pragmatism, about maybe Midwestern values, but also about an American character for their buildings. And that narrative of a natural American style sang long across the decades to celebrate Chicago.
Between 1880 and 1890, the population of Chicago doubled to more than 1 million. Constrained by geography, land in the Loop area was limited, sending real estate prices sky high. Landlords, having paid close to $1 million for their quarter-acre slice of the city, needed to capitalize on their investments. The CBD really had nowhere to go but up.
Nobody wanted to build skyscrapers out to the west and to the south, and if you're going to have an office, you're going to have it in the Loop.
In the 1880s, the Home Insurance Building was the tallest in Chicago's CBD, an important architectural landmark until its demolition in 1931.
The Home Insurance Building is widely considered the world's first skyscraper because the walls of the building were liberated from any structural role, and that meant the entire kind of structural weight of the building was taken with a lightweight metal frame.
Chicago's first buildings, post-apocalypse, featured traditional load-bearing walls of brick and stone. But buildings that are supported by fireproof metal frames distribute the weight of each floor more evenly, so walls could be considerably thinner.
You know, before you had those structural frames, you could only go as high as those thick masonry laws would let you go. Before, you had no space left to rent because your walls would be so thick. Once steel was invented as a way to hold essentially a skyscraper, all of a sudden you had the ability to open up those floors to real estate and go up.
The Home Insurance Building was built in 1885. Its old-school facade blended in with the streetscape, but its height made it stand out. Initially 10, then 12 stories high. It was designed by William LeBaron Jenney, the father of the American skyscraper.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about his inspiration. He was at home, and his wife had brought in lunch.
And she put a real heavy book on this bird cage, and you'd think, well, you know, that the thing would crash. But then he realized that this so-called cage construction, you can put a lot of weight on without having heavy walls on the outside.
And that was the kind of eureka moment for him.
So really the two key technologies were the steel, which allowed buildings to go much higher in a way that hadn't been possible using masonry load-bearing walls, and the elevator, which was able to transport these people.
Steel frames allowed buildings to go higher, but without the advent of elevators, they'd never have gotten off the drawing board, let alone the ground.
Elijah Graves Otis was born in 1811 in Vermont. He was a known inventor. It's one uncommon belief is that he invented the elevator. He actually invented the safety brake, which made elevators safe. The safety brake, he mounted a spring connected to the hoist rope. In the event of a failure, there were ratchets that were mounted to the sides. If it lost tension, it would enact the ratchets to close and clamp down on the guide rails, stopping the elevator in motion, thus keeping the elevator from plunging to the ground. At the World Fair, he brought the full elevator into the building, and then he got on himself. As the crowd gathered, he took an axe and cut the hoist rope. The crowd gasped, but the elevator did not collapse because the safety mechanism worked. Clamped to the side, stopped the elevator from free-falling, and he announced, "All safe." And to this day, "All safe" is on the patches of all of our mechanics uniforms in North America.
Until the 1880s, let's say, the top floors were the worst floors, were the least desirable floors because people had to travel up the stairwells to get to those places. And then when they introduced the elevator, after the Civil War, elevators became common technologies in office buildings, hotel buildings. Then that changed the dynamic, and people were really interested in working on the higher floors.
Electric passenger elevators were still in their infancy during the American Technical Revolution, a decade-long burst of creativity that, quite literally, hoisted architecture to the next level. Bessemer steel, which was more flexible than cast iron, progressed structural engineering. Street trams, railways, and subways contributed to the changing urban landscape, delivering white-collar workers from suburban neighborhoods to centralized locations in the city. And everything from typewriters to telephones were helping to revolutionize office environments at the top end of downtown.
So all of that infrastructure came at around the same time, and once it was in place, the buildings just started growing enormously.
So I would tend to say probably the Reliance building in Chicago is a more interesting example of what was the beginning of skyscrapers, because it used steel probably to a larger extent, and the concept of having a rigid frame or a braced frame that was able to stabilize itself against the wind was more evident.
With its steel superstructure anchored in a thick bed of concrete, the Reliance building on North State Street, Chicago, is exemplary from an engineering perspective. But the structure is architecturally significant thanks to its glassy facade. Designed by Daniel Burnham and Charles Atwood, the 16-story commercial tower, an add-on to the original 4-story structure, was the first skyscraper to use large sheets of plate glass. Apart from reducing the overall weight and cost of the building, it increased its overall efficiency.
If you have bigger glass, you can have more light coming into the building, and therefore you can get more efficiency, productivity from the workers in the building.
At this time, there was no air conditioning systems. There were electric lighting was incandescent lighting. So natural ventilation and daylight were really important in these early office buildings.
The Chicago school solution to the light and ventilation problem was soon resolved with the development of the Chicago window.
Chicago window being this large fixed plane of plate glass with movable side lights on either side. So your double hung windows that operate would be on either side, much smaller, and you'd have this gigantic plate glass in the center.
So a very simple idea. And this became quite prominent in buildings like the Reliance building, which became the prototype for the modern curtain wall building of today.
As it searched for new ways to solve complex problems, the Chicago School became a pioneer in both innovation and collaboration.
Another aspect of the Chicago School was, I think, the significance of the relationship between the engineer and the architect.
It's Burnham working with his team. You got Shanklin as an engineer. You got all these people working together to make a great building.
The engineer was entirely incorporated into that firm.
Another concept attributed to the Chicago School was the notion that form follows function, that the shape of a building should relate to its function and purpose.
There was the logic of the steel frame and expressing that structural system, but there was also the poetry of men like Louis Sullivan, who said of the skyscraper, form ever follows function. And the skyscraper should be tall, every inch of it tall. It should be a tall and soaring thing. This artistic expression of the skyscraper was married to an idea about what an American ethic was, not something recognizably appropriated from European tradition, but something that was Native American became a kind of theory or ideology of the Chicago School.
Chicago took on this strong structural expression identity early on, and that was exported as an idea.
In 1893, a serious economic depression hit the US. Financial panic started in New York, but quickly spread across the rest of the country. 500 banks closed their doors. 15,000 businesses folded. Surplus office space in Chicago led to the council backing a plan that helped those in the real estate game counter their diminishing profits. They imposed a limit on the height of any new buildings in the CBD, effectively flatlining the skyscraper boom that was keeping the heart of the city alive. Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. were similarly spooked by the panic, but New York's developers and investors remained resolute. The real estate market chilled, but the skyscraper industry was spared the indignity of being put on ice.
So my reading of the 1893 panic as it influenced sort of New York City's real estate market was it kind of chilled things for a bit, but it couldn't really stop this juggernaut, which was the growth of New York City, growth of the modern American metropolis. New York City was founded in the 1620s by Dutch merchants. Okay, so New York City has always been a merchant city. It always had an eye towards commerce and towards growth.
It's the East Coast nexus, but also the European nexus of connections for trade, as it had been all through the 19th century. And so by the 1870s, New York is almost 1 million population, and it is a driving engine of capitalism.
In 1892, the local building code, which required the use of masonry for fireproofing, was quashed, allowing New York firms the opportunity to follow Chicago's lead, using steel frame construction.
And then that created vast quantities of new real estate, which further produced economic growth and attracted more businesses. And then you have these sort of positive feedback cycles where new growth generates more growth.
The rise of Manhattan's skyline attracted its fair share of critics, but no single building polarized the city quite like Daniel Burnham's Flatiron Building.
Flatiron Building is an interesting case.
In a city that is defined by the grid in Manhattan, here we have a triangular building which is informed by the diagonal of Fifth Avenue.
The New York Times called it a monstrosity, a stingy piece of pie, the greatest inanimate troublemaker in New York.
Its architecture is in a way like a Greek column with a base, a shaft of multiple stories, and a capital, the kind of decoration at the top of the building.
Shaped like a right-angled triangle, its prow barely 2 meters wide, the Flatiron rises 87 meters straight up from the street. It was one of the first skyscrapers to do this, an audacious departure away from the heavy, block-like bases that typically gave tall buildings at that time an aura of stability. Flatiron's engineers had every confidence in their design, but the public was somewhat skeptical, fearing the structure would blow over as soon as it was built.
It was also about incorporating those technologies of stiff frames and rigid construction, because it was a fairly slender building for those days. So it demonstrated the essence of what a skyscraper needs to do structurally as well.
The building stayed upright, but its vertical faces notoriously intensified wind gusts circling its base.
There was also an episode where apparently a courier was washed away from the footpath as a result of the wind hitting the tower, coming down the facade and sweeping through the footpath. And this poor boy was then killed by an automobile that was coming on the street. So it gives this sense that skyscraper also had an impact on their surroundings.
The corner of Fifth Avenue and 23rd Street became an increasingly popular place for people watching, particularly among the young men of the day, as ladies were regularly taken by surprise when the wind swiftly lifted their skirts, revealing, God forbid, their ankles. While many New Yorkers were drawn to the drama on the streets around the Flatiron, others were captivated by the building itself, igniting the city's passion for architecture and a distinctive sense of style.
Certainly Daniel Burnham designed the Flatiron Building, but I think that the iconography of the Flatiron Building is decisively New York.
The Flatiron was probably historically, in the historiography of architecture, was one of those moments where suddenly the impact of a tall building on the city was realized. But there was also this postcard quality of the building that you could just use to say, hey, this is New York, look at that.
The Flatiron became the most talked about building of the era. Indeed, its popularity hasn't waned in over a century. inspiring legions of architects and engineers in their quest to build to the sky. Apart from the rather prosaic need to cash in on limited space, why do we feel the need to build up?
We always try to reach for the sky, just a natural, I guess, basic elements of humans.
Because people are ambitious. We have something called human spirit.
Why do people climb mountains? Why the quest for flight, to defy gravity, to ascend? I think it's human nature.
As engineers, building high up is fun, it's innovative, and it also gives us a challenge and an opportunity. How do you still build up and look down and connect with the ground?
If you go all the way back to the beginning of skyscrapers, the wish to build high is partly for the prestige of the city and partly for the prestige of the individual.
A kind of display of power or wealth or prosperity. And we've been doing that ever since the Egyptians with the pyramids, tallest churches in the world. And today, that's more about capitalism and displaying the power and wealth and the iconography of a country or a city to a global audience.
I grew up in suburbia. I know what it's like. You drive in a car, houses are spread apart. So the idea of compacting the way that we live is a huge positive. And, the skyscraper and going up is a big part of how we compact a city.
The city can't just sprawl forever. It puts incredible strain on the transport infrastructure. It's easier to have people working closer together.
Today we have cities that are megacities, populations that exceed 20 million people, and they're growing. Tall buildings in that respect have become almost a necessity rather than an option.
They're maximizing the concept of real estate location, location, location. So there's a concept of place and the tall building, right? Because the site is extruded relentlessly.
So if you and I want to live in the same piece of land, the only way we're going to be able to do that is by living above or below each other. So it's the same thing with renting office space. If everybody wants to be in a particular market, there's enough demand to build up.
The most basic reason is profit. And that equation will never change. Total development value less total cost equals developers' profit. That's the main reason.
At the turn of the century, skyscrapers were beginning to dominate the Manhattan horizon. The city and its population was growing at a rate of knots. The Lower East Side had become the most densely populated place on the globe, and a never-ending stream of immigrants put pressure on the city to expand.
Well, I would say in parallel to the growth of businesses was the need for transportation innovations and transportation and infrastructure investments. So the Brooklyn Bridge becomes one of the first key attempts to sort of link Brooklyn with Lower Manhattan and allow for people to kind of commute and walk over the bridge, and it eliminated the ferry. And then by the turn of the 20th century, New York City starts building its famous subway system.
In the early years of the 20th century, construction above ground could barely keep pace with the number of people flocking to the city. Everyone wanted a slice of the Big Apple and its promise of untold riches. New York became the city of skyscrapers. The first great age had arrived.
From the first skyscrapers in New York through at least the early 1920s, New York architects were very wedded to the traditions of Europe. They traveled more, may have attended the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where classicism would have been the standard that they absorbed. But they were also attracted to the styles of the past that seemed very suitable to the height and soaring aspiration of the skyscrapers.
In the heyday, the golden age of the skyscraper America, there was this incredible self-confidence. They're about pride and they're about doing something well and something that will endure over time.
As architects and engineers became more assured, buildings became more sophisticated. Architects and engineers all but dared each other to build higher into the sky. Never shy of pursuing creative innovation, the Singer Manufacturing Company inspired the charge. Their specific intent was for the Singer Tower to be the tallest office building in the world.
These buildings are done a floor a week. It's astonishing. And then quickly clad in terracotta of some kind. You can just imagine somebody looking at this and looking at a floor a week and having a building occupied in a matter of months, which is absolutely staggering.
Ernest Flagg, the architect responsible for the Singer Tower, was not a fan of skyscrapers that rose straight up from the corners of their plots. He felt anything over 10 to 15 stories should sit well back from the street, allowing the lower levels of the building to create an ordered urban ensemble. At 187 metres, Singer's new corporate headquarters was groundbreaking, but its pole position as the tallest building in the world was remarkably short-lived. Within a year, the Metropolitan Life Tower in Lower Manhattan had set a new benchmark. Architect Napoleon Lebrun believed style was more important than innovation, that this and other tall buildings in the city should reflect longevity and stability. So it was no coincidence that his slender addition to the existing MetLife building resembles St. Marco's bell tower in Venice. The MetLife Campanile came to symbolize the company's success, even featuring in its advertising with a light beaming from the top of its spire.
Today we recognize these crowns as an element of the skyline, so there's an expectation that the top has to be something else. It can't just be a roof. It's not just a roof, it's a fifth facade, but it's more than that. It's also a symbolic representation of what the city is about.
So the buildings did advertise themselves, they advertised the business, but they also accommodated the growing population of workers that needed to be at the city center.
When New York was first colonized, people's place of home and work were essentially the same. They might have had their shop down on the ground floor, but they lived upstairs. And then over time, as neighborhoods evolved, people didn't necessarily want to live where they worked. So the minute you segregated work and home, you started developing an office culture. You had a demand for people to work in the same place in a way they didn't before. They didn't have to have tools, they didn't have to have big machinery. They essentially were pushing paper, which you could do in a fairly confined area on any floor.
Skyscrapers were fast becoming a way for corporations to not only house their workers, but to rent space to other companies as well. Haley Fisk, the then vice president of the MetLife Corporation, was far from coy about his company's investment, boasting to its board that the new building didn't cost a cent because the tenants footed the bill. This coupling of the sacred and secular, this synthesis of a European style associated with religion and overt commercialization, peaked in the first stage of skyscrapers, with the completion of the Woolworth Building at 233 Broadway.
Cass Gilbert gave us the moniker of the skyscraper as the machine that made the land pay. And the Woolworth Building was called the Cathedral of Commerce. Such was this tie to economics, to finance, that kind of gave rise to its construction.
Woolworth, he wasn't a very good salesman, apparently, in the stores. And so he got this idea of that merchandise should sell itself. And so he had big display windows. And then he invented this idea of the 5 and dime store, where everything in there was a nickel or a dime. And he didn't require the salespeople to be gifted at salesmanship. All they had to do was ring up the cash register. So it was just a wholly different concept of selling. He didn't immediately come to the idea of having this biggest skyscraper in the world, but then the Singer Building went up, and then later on the Metropolitan Life Building was built, and he hated that company, the Metropolitan Life, so he decided that I gotta have a building bigger than they had.
Sitting on one of the most prominent corners in downtown Manhattan, this was an extravagant trophy building with no expense spared. Grand arcade entrance, marble walls and floors, Tiffany elevator doors, 17 million bricks, 29 elevators, 3,000 hollow steel doors. The list of components that went into the building is staggering. So too the space it encompassed.
So by the end, he had the tallest office building in the world. And this idea of using buildings to sell yourself or reward yourself or something like that was part of the game at that time, I think.
And so the rise of the skyscraper through the sort of companies that put up those very, very tall ones in the early part of the 20th century, spoke to who was controlling things at that time.
Construction of the Woolworth Building, which commenced in August 1911, was completed by April 1913, a record-breaking skyscraper built in record time.
The most important thing to understand about tall building under construction, it's almost, imagine a reverse engineering of the assembly chain of Ford. Where you have machinery and product that moves across, and you have workers always doing the same thing in the same place. In a tall building, it's a different dynamic, where you have someone doing always the same thing, but moving in space in a corkscrew fashion. So you constantly move from place to place on the floor, and then from one floor to the other. So then the repetitivity of the construction starts. So this assembly chain aspect begins. And this is conventionally you should proceed on one floor at a week.
They must have wire cables for nerves.
We see these photographs of them wandering along these steel beams, which are truly terrifying. But we must realize also the nature of fixing steel beams, which didn't involve any scaffolding, was to rivet them with hot rivets.
Now, riveters were somehow a product of World War I, where the shipbuilding of the Great War created a lot of skills in rivet connections that were then borrowed by the construction industry into the construction of skyscrapers. Now, a very labor-intensive technique that relied on having pre-drilled or pre-punched holes on beams. The beams had to be lined up, and then the rivets had to be of course, heated up on site on a furnace, thrown to a catcher, then fed into a hole, then had to be kept in place on one side, punched on the other. Then the rivet would shrink and keep the steel together. So you can imagine the amount of labor involved, the amount of risk and safety associated with that.
I mean, they had all kinds of safety procedures, but you're working in certain places where the building is just steel girders and so on and so forth, and it's possible to fall off.
And if you think walking along a dry steel beam is dangerous, imagine what it must have been like in even a light breeze and a drizzle coming down to walk along a slippery beam in a 100-story building.
Perhaps you could relate to those workers who chose to, rather than being in a factory line, you moving, you making it up as you go. So the people who build them, they make the skyscrapers theirs.
While many New Yorkers viewed skyscrapers as inspirational monuments, others saw them only as monsters. Few attracted the level of controversy that dogged the Equitable Building.
The Equitable Building, which is still existing today and functioning, is basically a sort of a U-shaped building that took a whole block, city block, and it was built like a monolithic rectilinear shape.
Here was a 40-story building, with a vertical extrusion of a floor plate, which created a massive hulking block.
And people didn't like it because it started casting shadows on several blocks around it, depending on the time of day. So people went out and really demanded for air and light in the streets.
And for many people, this was enough. And this ushered in a very famous piece of legislation called the 1916 New York Zoning Law.
The first citywide zoning code in America primarily imposed limits on a building's mass. Towers could only occupy a certain percentage of their lot, scaled according to their location.
So you had skyscrapers that started to represent that kind of famous wedding cake kind of style. And that wasn't stylistic, that was environmental. That was designed such that the sun would penetrate deep into the streets below and the shadows would be minimalized.
So New York had still retained this idea that you could build into the skies. You could build as tall as you wanted, but only on a portion of the land.
Tiered skyscrapers took the rising popularity of the Art Deco style soaring into the skies. The imposing Barclay-Vessey telephone building, often credited with being the first skyscraper to use the zoning resolution as a design asset, was also the first to incorporate Art Deco motifs into the building's ornamentation. Originally referred to as a style moderne, Art Deco was a key feature of the 1925 International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris.
That 1925 show about what was the modern spirit was taken over as a kind of fashion in New York.
Art Deco flourishes were used to accentuate the building's dimensions, adding to the visual drama that would inevitably become a hallmark of the setback style. The decade they dubbed the Roaring Twenties was a busy one in America, as the post-war construction catch-up took anyone and everyone in the real estate game along for a roller coaster ride.
And so by the early mid-1920s, the business climate is improving and there's this tremendous real estate shortage, both for housing and for offices. And so the real estate community in New York City, for example, really turned to a project of massive building.
A quarter of the financial district in New York was rebuilt, adding over 1.5 million square meters of office space into the mix. The situation in Chicago was no different. Commercial properties were in short supply and rents had gone through the roof. City planners lifted existing height restrictions, allowing Chicago to rejoin the race to build to the sky. Once again, the city was caught in the grip of what historian Merrill Schleer called skyscraper mania.
The very term skyscraper, as opposed to high-rise building or tall building or multi-story, skyscraper is a romantic term, and it brings in the mind's eye the sky, a slender building, a silhouette against the sky.
Everyone in the city owns, in a way, the skyline. It belongs to them, so inevitably new pieces of the skyline draw people's interest.
Well, you know, these things are immortalized in so many tourist snapshots all around the world.
Trinkets that someone's selling, t-shirts, all of these things, and those are great, and people get excited about them, and I think they always will.
Skyscraper mania reached its zenith with a competition soliciting designs for the Chicago Tribune Tower.
The owner of the Chicago Tribune, Colonel Robert McCormick, was another egomaniac, you might say, like Woolworth. And he wanted something that would be a tribute to him and it would be something grandiose. And so he had this competition for a design of the building.
So the intention of the Tribune Tower competition, and Colonel McCormick's intention, naturally, was to build the most beautiful building in the world.
The prize money offered was $100,000. In today's terms, that's nearly $1.5 million. So it goes without saying it attracted attention, with hundreds of architects submitting designs.
Some were whimsical, some were farcical, and some of those, done by European modernists, harken back to the first Chicago school, being minimalist, no ornament at all, which is not really what American architects were doing in the 1920s.
Ultimately, a couple of New York-based architects won, Raymond Hood and John Mead Howells. Hood and Howells' Gothic Revival design appealed to McCormick's traditional values, the substantial space it enveloped, his commercial acumen. Famous quotations from the likes of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson graced the lobby walls, while the facade was adorned with fragments of stone collected by Tribune reporters from significant sites around the world.
The story goes that he had his stringers in the different cities as part of their job, send him these bits and pieces early on to embed in the lower levels, to prove that he's got connections everywhere, and therefore your news comes from everywhere, and it's a first-person news, from believable news, not fake news.
To say the Roaring Twenties was socially notorious in America is nothing short of an understatement. A new culture was emerging in the country, centered in downtown New York. Jazz music was really coming into its own, influencing everything from fashion to prohibition and mainstream culture. New York became entertainment central. It was an exciting time to be living and working in New York City, and corporations were tripping over themselves for a prestigious CBD address.
Operating in a skyscraper is quite an expensive business. So why does anybody do it? Well, people do it because they want to be right in the center of where everything's happening.
In the late 1920s, the Woolworth Building was still the tallest on Manhattan's skyline, goading two other giants of industry into action. Car magnate Walter Chrysler and Wall Street hotshot George Ostrom, spurred on by their equally competitive architects, each party sought to outdo the other, aspiring to pit the Woolworth Building and the world's tallest structure, the renowned Eiffel Tower in Paris.
Walter Chrysler saw the Chrysler Building as part of a pet project, part of a way to express his wealth and his business acumen, if you will.
Walter Chrysler unashamedly referred to his building as a monument to me. A 77-floor tower crowned by an incredible tiered dome and finial, which not only managed to reflect the status of its owner, but the very essence of New York, circa the Roaring Twenties. Epitomizing the Art Deco style, it was bold and undeniably beautiful.
Buildings, by virtue of their competitive nature to be the world's tallest building, become recognizable to people through the public relations that they present, through their recognizability on the skyline, to be sure.
It was transition towards the big gesture that becomes the symbol of the building. It's dominating the skyline. It's the beginning of a super tall culture.
It was clearly built for the car guy. Its friezes looked like hubcaps, and the stainless steel gargoyles jutting out from the last setback of the tower resembled the eagle head hood ornaments on the 1929 Chrysler Plymouth. The proposed completion height of the Chrysler Building was a carefully guarded secret, changing quite a few times during construction, forcing Erstrom's architect, Craig Severance, to pile floor after floor onto his building just to stay in the race.
Historically, it might have been families competing or churches competing. Here we had corporations competing.
Ultimately, Severance was outfoxed by his wily rival, architect William Van Allen. He had built the spire for the Chrysler Building inside the dome, so the first Severance even knew of its existence was when it rose out of the building's core, adding a whopping 56 meters of shining brilliance to the skyscraper.
It's the first to top the Eiffel Tower in height, the first building to exceed 1,000 feet in height, so this is amazing.
The belief in new technology, the risk that they took to build something like that, but it just set the scene. To me, it's just a beautiful, beautiful building and timeless.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market price.
Ironically, the Chrysler Building topped out the day before the Wall Street crash.
You have the Roaring Twenties, and there is a sense of euphoria, and there's a sense of kind of limitless possibility. And then the stock market crashes. And people in New York, they're not quite sure what's gonna happen. There's this kind of wait and see attitude because they've experienced recessions before. They've experienced downturns before. By the end of 1929, the office vacancy rates around Wall Street were practically zero.
Real estate speculators had invested heavily in skyscrapers during the Roaring Twenties. When the stock market crashed, there were literally dozens of major buildings underway in New York, so there was little choice but to complete them. Within 11 months of the Chrysler's completion, it was eclipsed by the eighth wonder of the modern world, the Empire State Building. Designed by William F. Lamb, it was commissioned by Empire State Incorporated, a group of wealthy investors that included John Jacob Raskob, Vice President of General Motors.
He didn't like the idea of Walter Chrysler having the world's tallest building. So him and his team devised a plan to build the Empire State Building, which would put Chrysler in second place.
One of the builders of the Empire State Building said, building a skyscraper is the closest peacetime equivalent to war, which is a pretty powerful statement. What he meant was that all efforts, all materials, all goods and flows, labor are sort of focused on one objective, which is to build this building. You could imagine the roads were shut down, trucks were bringing in material. Everything was sort of focused on this war effort.
There she is, the Empire State Building, 102 stories high.
The 68-meter mooring mast on the Empire State was a late addition to the building, bringing its total height to 381 meters, easily making it the tallest building in the world, a position it held right up until 1972. It was the first skyscraper to exceed 100 stories. A truly monumental structure that took up an entire city block.
Even the Chrysler Building looks like an Austin compared to the new giant.
The Empire State Building was built in 11 months, during the Great Depression. And so how is that possible? If you think about it, we could not build a building like that today.
So you can imagine what that did for, when it was built. I just look back and try and picture something of that magnitude being built at the time, in that period, I think is just extraordinary.
The Empire State Building is intrinsically tied to New York and intrinsically tied to tall building history. It was the tallest building in the world for almost 40 years, a monumental achievement, and its height at the time, is still taller than any building in Europe, for example. So, I think it's a remarkable building.
The Empire State Building is well recognized as the symbol of an entire city. It's one of those postcard images.
And that has sort of been burned into our collective, imagination of what a city is and what New York is.
The Empire State Building, still in most people's minds, is the establishment shot for New York City.
In that sense, it's a kind of public image that's collectively owned.
The Wall Street crash led to the Great Depression and inevitably brought the tall building boom in New York to an end. The situation was similar in Chicago, but adding insult to injury in the Windy City, developers took a wrecking ball to the hallowed Home Insurance Building, the skyscraper accredited with being the world's first. LeBaron Jenney's vision for the longevity of this and other first Chicago school buildings was crushed along with the rubble. His dream for future generations, gazing upon the many marvels of that era, was that they would forever be able to read the feelings and aspirations of those who erected them. And even though many no longer exist, we can still pay homage to the father of skyscrapers and his inspired and inspiring cohort.
Skyscraper is the most public piece of architecture. The public in the sense that the public feels a connection to the skyline in a way that they don't feel a connection to, say, the single-family house. But the idea of the skyline as that's my skyline, that's a kind of really powerful idea.
And skylines give personality to place. So one skyscraper alone is not very interesting. But the minute you see an assemblage of skyscrapers that start to make a place from a distance that you can identify when you land at LaGuardia Airport, you land at Kennedy, when you see this, when you're across the Hudson River in New Jersey and you look at it and you think, that's a place. Because they together represent this mass of humanity that has somehow managed to live in such close proximity so successfully for such a long period of time.
So if you study skyscrapers, you understand how cities changed. you understand what was the driving values that transformed cities over time. So the fascinating topic of research in the built environment, looking at the history of these buildings, an opportunity to discover lessons from the past. And ultimately, it's very important to do that because we need to understand that those buildings are part of our heritage.